I wanted to fly. That was my youthful dream. But then I grew too tall for fighter cockpit and too blind. I've been a nurse for 31 years now. In 2012 is when I made that pivot. Creating that psychological safety component is the number one thing for your team to constantly give you that feedback from bottom to top. People want to work where they feel heard, where they feel that they can contribute, where they're able to be creative.
With that complexity, how do you start categorizing risks or getting your hands around it so you can actually mitigate them?
One of the greatest approaches that I've ever learned, and the one that I still fall back to, comes from...
Welcome to the Agathos Consulting Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Neds, the founder and CEO of Agathos Consulting. I'm honored to be joined today by Wadie Abu-Ramah. He is the Director of Risk Management and Patient Safety at AdventHealth, the largest Florida-based health system with over 50 hospitals and 96,000 employees. Wadie, thank you so much for joining the show today.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start with a little bit about your background, how you got into your current role, and maybe what you were thinking about doing when you were younger, starting out.
Yeah, so I wanted to fly. That was my youthful dream. But then I grew too tall for fighter cockpit and too blind, and I have to use glasses. And so it wasn't optimal at that point. I'm a people person. I'm outgoing, and I love to learn. And the whole fun of first aid and emergencies and things like that was always in me. I took care of all the critters around the neighborhood that were lost or hungering or hurt. So my mother saw something in me, and she had met a PhD in nursing gentleman who was teaching at the Jordanian University. And he was an American, and she knew my passion for America and Americans because I grew up going to an American mission school in Liberia in West Africa. And so she introduced me and she said, "Hey, I want you to meet this guy. He's a nurse." I'm like, "A nurse? A guy? A nurse? That doesn't make any sense." We're talking about 87, 88. And so I came to America to go to nursing school. And I was the one of two guys in a class of 120 young ladies. And I thought that was a confirmation I was in the right place. So I graduated with 40 of them a few years later, and nursing has been my career. So I started off at the bedside, did a lot of work there. I had exposure in the outpatient setting in home health care. I helped start an equipment company and an infusion pharmacy. So I dealt with a little bit of the business aspect as well as the healthcare piece, and it groomed in me a little bit of desire to expand that. And then over time, having been around aviation and flight medicine, doing aviation and dealing with the crew resource management processes and that whole checklist mentality added to the kind of perspective on safety. And that basically led into the next step, which was risk management and patient safety.
If you broke down your career, is it 50% like nursing, 50% risk management, or?
Yeah, I've been a nurse for 31 years now, and basically in 2012 is when I made that pivot into risk management and patient safety. So 12 years of this, a little bit more on the other.
So was it a hard transition switching over?
No, not really. It just seemed very natural because in aviation, doing clinical type work, and because of aviation, with flight medicine, you're dealing with patients in multiple sites, multiple disciplines, multiple backgrounds. So you're flying the newborns, you're flying grandma and grandpa in for heart caths and bleeds. I had high risk OB, things like that. So I had a diversity of knowledge and experience. And at the same time, that whole safety mentality about things just was the very next step into doing investigations, looking into processes, improving on it, and knowing how to do so, right? The whole root cause analysis process and things like that. So it just felt like a natural progression. And then it was about learning and deepening your experience in risk management and patient safety techniques. And then you get into more of an enterprise risk management perspective as opposed to just clinical risk management. And that's looking at an 8-domain perspective. But we teach that as part of healthcare risk management as well.
In your time as a nurse, you see all kinds of things, I'm sure. Did you just always have a personality to be able to deal with high pressure situations, or did you have to learn emotional intelligence?
I think we're all groomed in some form or fashion about some of these things, and it influences the rest of your life to some degree. But I am the eldest of four. There was that responsibility piece. So I'm a sheepdog. I'm a watchdog. I'm a protector by nature. And then at the same time, that was groomed into me by my parents. Watch out for your brother. Look out for this. Do this, that, and the other. We lived in Liberia, West Africa, but we traveled between Lebanon, Liberia, Jordan. We were in Europe. So we had a lot of opportunity to move around a little bit. But those areas also, we drove from blockade to another blockade, showing passports, being respectful about what you say, guards with guns, things like that. So some of these things start to build in you a cautious approach, collaborating with others, reading the room, understanding who the stakeholders are, things like that, getting your EQ on and understanding what that looks like. It's about self-preservation to some degree, which kind of is more of a natural type thing, but it's also about how do you win friends and influence people, right? So I didn't read that book until I was 20 something years old. And I'm like, where was this all my life? But yet I, not knowing, that was already trained in me as well. But I think those are things that are really important for someone coming out into a business setting and things like that, to read these older books that understands the order of things and stuff like that. Today, we still want that openness, and you try to flatten the ranks as much as possible. And we'll talk a little bit more about it here from a standpoint of psychological safety and things like that. But being aware how people think is really important for how you do things in the future. So, yeah.
When your role is working with risk management, what are some of the biggest challenges that you faced in that role?
I think the hardest part sometimes in my area of risk management, dealing more on the hospital, clinical healthcare type thing, is when you have a mistake that's happened in a financial situation, it can be catastrophic. If you have a accident that happens in aviation, it can be catastrophic, and obviously it affects people's lives. But ultimately, in healthcare, day in and day out, you have millions of patients coming through. You have millions of interactions happening day to day and year to year. And those lead to so many varieties of different issues. And sometimes it just feels, okay, this is never going to end. As diverse as we are as human beings, as varied as medicine is and as specialized as it has become, the inputs are so many, and controlling for things is almost unspeakable, right? It's a massive job, but at the same time, that's part of it. I think a little bit of my ADHD keeping entertained.
So with that complexity, how do you start going about maybe categorizing risks or getting your hands around it so you can actually mitigate them?
I can tell you probably one of the greatest approaches that I've ever learned, and the one that I still fall back to, comes from the training that the Institutes for Health Improvement put together. And there's Michael Leonard and Alan Frankel, two great physicians who led some tremendous work around this. The whole concept behind this is, think about a circle with puzzle pieces all the way around. One puzzle piece says leadership, and then above it, it says culture, and then below it is learning, right? So that puzzle piece of leadership connects culture and learning. And we have to start driving a culture that basically wants to learn. So in order to complete that circle, you go through puzzle piece after puzzle piece, and it goes first into the culture section, psychological safety and transparency, right? That bit basically begins to create a partner with the fingertips of your organization, the people that are going to be stubbing their toes on the problems, the processes that we as in leadership put in place, the policies that we cascade down to the front line that don't consider what the actual work is going to require ultimately. And we have things around that, right? You do FAMIAs, you do process improvement. We've got Six Sigma, we have Lean, all these different things that work into mitigating these things. But creating that psychological safety component is the number one thing for your team to constantly give you that feedback from bottom to top. And then it cascades back down in the fix, right? And then once we are able to begin to drive that culture from a standpoint of that psychological safety, then we begin to learn and iterate through a process of, we use the PDSA, Plan, Do, Study, Act, right? That cycle of looking at what are the options, what are the opportunities, what are the issues, putting the fix in, and then testing and cycles of iteration. So that's really where it begins. And so if you go into any space, whether it's healthcare, whether it's a bank, whether it's anything, you have to think about what is leadership doing to drive a culture, learning process. So that's really where it is. And then you get your expertise from different people that will basically help plan the specifics and the dots from one place to the other. That's really my fallback to when it comes down to starting anything.
So to touch on the psychological safety and transparency, like
Mm-hmm.
how do you actually create a culture that is transparent and where people are okay with letting you know about issues?
I think you lead by example for sure, and that's going to require executive rounding, meeting and talking to that frontline team and saying, hey, what are the issues that you stub your toe on? Is there something that's there? And then we in healthcare, really, our companies basically built a process where you huddle and debrief, right? So you huddle in the morning and this is our plan forward. Does anybody have any concerns, any issues? So people are able to speak up about it. You're never going to say, oh, this is not good or whatever. You're always going to say, tell me why. And then the decisions are made based off of a green, yellow, red stoplight. Here it is. Oh, this is a great idea. I don't see why we don't. Low hanging fruit, boom, done. If it's something that needs a little bit more information, okay, this is going to be in our yellow section. We're going to be thinking about this. We have to evaluate. There's going to be some decision making, and then we'll bring it back by 10, 11 o'clock in the morning. And by the afternoon, there's a cascade that's already mitigating or giving follow through on that team. That churn basically doesn't let any of this stuff settle and go away, because as soon as it goes away, the team member who suggested it, oh, you wanted my voice. I told you didn't do anything about it. So you have to constantly have a outline that moves it forward. And so we have a system where it allows us to put this stuff visually for suggestions that are brought up, concerns that are brought up, and it moves it down the road. And people can go back and say, this was my concern, and we did this and that and the other about it. There's clarity about it. And then we use a safety culture survey that basically asks some specific questions. This is a well-studied survey that's statistically managed. And we ask those questions. Are we learning in our environment? Do we take time to reflect back and plan forward? All sorts of different questions specifically around driving culture. And it's evaluated, and we go back and we get feedback from the team year over year. In Florida, the Agency for Healthcare Administration's kind of required it as an annual thing that's going to become publicly reported. Not only quality metrics, but now your safety culture survey, which is a little bit punitive in its way. But at the same time, it's just adding to that level of accountability that healthcare is now having to account for. Not only do I deliver outcomes, this is the data and this is the experience that I'm giving you, and I'm getting paid based off of that outcomes and experience now by Medicare and Medicaid specifically. And we're going to be seeing that follow through with a lot of the third-party payers. And then you've got the aspect of the safety culture survey, which is now going to be publicly out there. And we already have some of those things with the leapfrog system. So our healthcare organizations have to meet certain specifics and demonstrate certain behaviors and things in order to get that category of leapfrog A or leapfrog B or leapfrog C, et cetera. And those are safety type scoring. Yeah.
So is that like an industry benchmark?
It is.
Okay.
It's very much so in healthcare. If you're a leapfrog, people are going to pay attention. People are going to say, okay, there's going to be a little bit more expectations to some degree, but at the same time, more resources, more people are going to refer to you and that type of thing. Whereas if you start sliding, people are going to notice. And that's something that your patient can go back and look at and say, what does a C or a D mean, and why am I going to that facility? So when you talk about like market share from the business side, those things matter. And it's tough. It's very tough. From when I started my career to today, the accountability level has risen so much, and that makes it very difficult. But that has also improved healthcare in general.
How do you manage the stress level because of the decisions you're making are impacting a lot of people?
It's certainly something we have to be very conscious of. And I think the biggest way is it's funny. When you have shares that you put into a stock market, right, they go up by 100%. You don't just leave them there to ride, because at some point they're going to come back down. You take some earnings off the top, right? So when you have processes and improvements and things that you're doing, I always tell my team, put that trophy on your shelf. So you have a folder that basically says, did it, exclamation point. Right? So you have to remind yourself of the good things that are happening. And we always celebrate these things through, whether it's with the team members themselves or with units, like when we have a recognition opportunity and things like that. Personally, I have my little mementos of, we did this, we got that, we got the other. Often, sometimes it's about pulling out letters that you read from patients or leaders or something like that. Thank you about this or that and the other. I know we got something done, and I know we're going to do more. And then really it comes back to, for me personally, it's really about the fact that I don't do this work just for me. I want to make sure that I, as a Christian, am saying to people around me, hey, I'm a Christian, I'm a believer. The work that I do matters. And I'm happy to say I work for an organization whose mission is extending the healing ministry of Christ. So I'm always reminded I need to make sure I don't bring shame to the name of Christ. So I have to go back and say, okay, Lord, I'm trusting you to do this. And I want to make sure that I capture this information and share that information with others too. My family is a great source of comfort for me. I love to spend time with them. And then I go hiking with a group of men a couple times a year or so, see some vistas and catch some cold air. And that's always a refresher.
So what are some of those wins? Could you tell me maybe an example or two of some of the ones that you kind of have in your mind?
In the last 6 years, I had been working within our campus sites at one of the hospitals, and then I left and I came back. I went out to the outpatient ambulatory and post-acute space. So I had responsibility for the medical group, lab, rehab, pharmacy, outpatient, hospice, home health, things like that. And then being able to take the things that I had started working on within the hospital, like culture surveys, driving executive rounding and things like that, going out to the medical group and starting that work with people in the outpatient setting. They're on their fifth or sixth survey that I got to start back in 2018. So that space had never been touched, and that we've never ever had a medical group take a safety culture survey before. That was the first time it got started. So that was a big thing for me. I got to go through Patient Safety Academy. When you have your C-suite going to a Patient Safety Academy, listening to an Alan Frankel, a Michael Leonard, and going through exercises about how you work on safety and the importance of safety culture and the drivers of safety culture. Because one of those things is when you're sitting here contracting with a physician, he might be a big guy, bring you a lot of money, bring a lot of patients, fantastic. But if he doesn't match your culture and he's going to be, alienating people around him, you're going to lose a lot more than you're going to gain in the process. And we unfortunately had our time of learning who those people were and getting the right people on the bus. But I can tell you, the C-suite that I know at the medical group still today, I interviewed some of these guys coming in and we talked about these things. And today they talk about safety culture. They send their leadership to the Safety Academy. And that is such a huge thing for me. And ultimately, when you think about it in a systems perspective, we are a self-insured trust, right? So we pay for claims that come up out of med mal or different things that happen. You get the right person on the bus, you have a better chance of mitigating your claims long term, right? And we are insuring these guys as well, because in the employed setting, in the medical group specifically, we have people that are contracted and that work in our system. Not some of them are our employees. And if I can't mitigate the risk of claims from my employees, how am I going to do it anywhere else? So these are the systems things that you start thinking about the inputs. And that kind of leads us into that whole enterprise risk management concept, right? You're not thinking just about a clinical setting. You're not just thinking about claims and a financial setting. You start thinking about, what's your strategy? What are the new innovations that are coming down the pike? What are the things that are going to happen? And what do I need to anticipate and put in place to mitigate that risk ahead of things happening? We had the pandemic come through, and we started purchasing these pulse oxes just to be able to get our patients through the ED, make sure that they're okay, and then send them home with a package of tools: blood pressure cuff, pulse ox, thermometer. And then somebody was calling them and checking their vital signs every 4 hours. The patient was taking it themselves, right? We're depending on a tool that came from God only knows where. We don't know that it's been calibrated as well as we need it to be. So it was easy to say, okay, here's this, but then I need to know that I'm getting correct information, correct data, and I don't have a patient who's getting worse at home and I'm not seeing that. So then you start building processes in place. You start getting trends on that same monitor to detect if it's going up or it's going down and things like that. So those are different things you start thinking about from an outcome. It's not the finance. It's not just the healthcare. It's the tools that you're using. Is the tool going to be sufficient to meet the need? And all sorts of different parts and pieces that play into that.
So you mentioned earlier there's 8 aspects to like
Yeah,
enterprise risk management. Is
right.
there a framework that you follow, or
Yeah.
yeah?
So for healthcare risk management, we look at the enterprise risk management, looking at 8 domains. And those domains end up being patient safety and clinical, human capital standpoints, legal, regulatory, and finance, hazards, and strategic and operational risks. Each one of those things to your bucket from a different perspective. Your human capital, you think about recruiting and hiring. You also think about retention and turnover. And all these things are affected by a lot of different facets. So you can't work that out in isolation. You think about your strategy. Your strategy could be around people, capital, programmatic expansions, different development that you're trying to do from capturing market and things like that. Finance, obviously, how you take care of your cash sitting around, or how do you mitigate losses in a situation like a major pandemic where you're spending money that you weren't planning on spending, where you have to try to maintain your human capital, although they can't be there for the whole entire time, but you don't want to lose them. So you decide to pay them for the next 3 months out of money that you weren't planning on spending, even though they're not doing anything, or you reallocate them to different places and things like that. Hazards, hurricanes, fires, workplace violence, riots, war, whatever the case might be. We work in a city here in Orlando that basically has exposure to tens of millions of tourists on a regular basis. The exposure from all over the world is very difficult. Plus, at the same time, containing all these different parts and pieces. And then you have the risks geopolitically from a standpoint of, you're a very large tourist capital, essentially, out here in Florida. So those are different facets that interconnect across this enterprise risk management. Legal, regulatory. We've had so much change in the regulatory scene just over the years, between government changes, pandemic issues, Medicare, Medicaid, trying to control their costs, things like that. The whole concepts of the ACOs and things that have been introduced over the last 10, 15 years, that legal regulatory is constantly in churn. So compliance with it, as well as being able to advocate for it one way or the other. And then, of course, claims and all the outputs that come from that.
So to drill in on just one of those, I was looking at a survey the other day. One of the CEO's top challenges is retaining talent, right? Retaining employees. So what are some ways that you mitigate against that specific domain?
Yeah, I think the biggest part in that is that culture driving. People want to work where they feel heard, where they feel that they can contribute, where they feel that they're able to be creative and have a little bit of creativity that they can do on their own, right? You have organizations that encourage people to invent or create and things like that and participate in the merits of whatever product comes out of it. I think driving a culture that allows people to have a voice and speak up and feel heard and contributing is going to be your greatest aspect of it. So we do safety culture surveys. From a human resources standpoint, we use Glint, which is another way similar to Gallup that basically ask opinions about what do you think? Do you feel comfortable? Do you feel heard? Things like that. But just as important, people want to be able to feel like they can grow. Sometimes it's about growing a career. Sometimes it's about personally growing. Not everybody's going to get promoted every year. And so you have to give people something that they feel they're personally growing, whether it's investment in their education, investment in their skill set that basically allow them to expand themselves too.
You mentioned allowing people the freedom to experiment and maybe innovate a little bit and
Mhm.
grow. How do you mitigate the risk of that experimentation when you're in healthcare? You don't want someone to try a new way to to
Right.
do certain things.
No, certainly. There's certain things that need to be done in a specific way. If you're going to be innovating in some way like that, those are called research or something. There's IRBs for that. You line up a research board and you present what you're going to be doing. There's specific regulations you have to comply with. Within an organization, there are research and development type departments, and in healthcare, we have research that's ongoing in different ways. So that's one thing. But when I say researching or being innovative, you can be innovative in just being able to change some things around and test a process. You have to get permission to do that and make sure that it's being done. Some companies have the opportunities to have, they're given a certain amount of time that they're allocated to say, okay, in this time, you can be developing a new thing. But it's usually in correlation with the work that's being done by whatever company it is, right?
I lived in Florida and I know that hurricanes are a big deal there. So how do you mitigate for the risk of that?
It's called an act of God for a reason because we don't often know which way it's going to go. But at the same time, I think you have to be strategic. You have to have your plans in advance and think through these things. You know that at a certain point, you're going to have a windstorm, and potentially, if you're in coastal areas, you're going to have surge. If you're in lower areas, you're going to have floods, different things like that. Of course, you could be like North Carolina and have absolutely no idea this was coming your way, and there's very little you can do about it. But now people are going to be thinking about what they're going to do about it. So I think it's important to horizon forecast what your horizon looks like. Look over that horizon and say, what is my worst case scenario? What is going to happen? You can mitigate by insuring for losses, right? So you have a certain capital that you can allocate towards insurance, and you can say, if I have this loss, if I have interruption of business for this is my losses, so I need to be able to cover for that. And you pay a high premium for these things. However, if you mitigating factors that you've already allocated and planned, that might decrease your cost, right? We also try to be as nimble as possible with what we do and how we think about it. It used to be we have like almost 300 sites that we are spread all over about 9 different counties. When you think about this large spread, this hurricane's coming in from one side and not the other. So you're closing certain spots and not closing the others. In the meantime, you have to think about a practice doesn't have a generator. So if I have vaccines in my fridge to the tune of tens of thousands of dollars that I might lose, I need to be thinking about what's my exit plan to do that. So ahead of time, I've already spoken with the local hospital, spoken with the pharmacist there. Do you have fridge space? Oh, no, I don't have this fridge, but if you buy a fridge, I'll plug it in for you and we can put it here on generator power. Excellent. So then I've got my exit strategy to do this. Now, this hurricane's coming in from Tampa. It's not going to expect these winds to get to 35 miles per hour where roads are going to become sustained, where they're going to say, okay, we're going to close roads or something like that until this hour because I can watch this all electronically thanks to technology these days. So I'm going to say, okay, we're going to work half a day and try to get all our patients in as quickly as we can. But then you're going to have to cancel the rest of these guys and schedule them for whenever that next thing happens. Take a list of these people, take a list of this. So you have a plan, you even all the way down to when you come back to evaluate the site, I need you to travel 2 by 2 because I don't want somebody get zapped by a power line or somebody looting. I want you to be careful going in, assessing what your damages are, and then phoning in. These people are going to be waiting to hear from you, and we've got this next plan. So being very strategic about this, people that have done safety, people that have done OSHA type work or something like that are really smart about this kind of stuff. We had a fire chief who was our safety officer from here, and I learned so much from him. He was a tremendous asset to the organization just to organize a lot of this emergency management type stuff. And there's courses and trainings and consultants and everything else that can help support that work too.
So what about I'm not sure which domain this would be under, but what about like supply chain issues?
Yeah, so absolutely. So tools and technology, I think would probably categorize that. Your supply chain is a very important part of the work that you do, obviously. There again, you want to have some foresight as to what is my typical usage, and then what do I expect a natural disaster or a pandemic to last, right? Typically, you're talking about something that's imminent or acute. You're talking about 2, 3 days, 5 days a week. Maybe if you're in a rural area, you're not going to get power for X long amount of time. Transporting things in and out, how do you do that? Plan for that, whether it's stocks and storage, making sure that it's in a good dry place. But at the same time, in this day and age, you can have let's call you the forward operating base, but then back at home base, somebody over here can be flying things in for you. I know for a fact that there's organizations delivering blood and supplies via drones in Africa into remote sites nowadays, right? So there's no excuse in the US of A for us not to be able to get things to people in an appropriate amount of time. It may take some effort, but obviously those are things that you have to plan in advance just to mitigate your risk. And then from a risk management perspective, you're always looking at, okay, if it's not something that's life or limb, and it's just a matter of I'm running out of stock of some sort, then it's about mitigating through insurance for what is it that's your business interruption plan and things like that. And then, of course, there's key person insurance and things like that for loss of life in situations where you're having to bring in a consultant because you don't have this leader or somebody you leaned on heavily.
So you mentioned drones. What are some maybe other trends that you've seen in the risk management space, but also healthcare?
Yeah.
What do you think the future looks like?
We're already doing so much with drones, and I fully expect them to get more and more automated and independent as AI is a huge piece that's coming on board for everybody very quickly. I was just reading that Google had a breakthrough with like quantum computing and things like that. Some of this is going to totally upend our understanding of what our capabilities are. But nevertheless, I think you have to look at AI is probably the next biggest thing. And we're seeing it already in healthcare, assisting in reading radiology films and things like that. But there's always going to be a human being between that AI and that patient, right? And so in other settings, we need to be cognizant of the fact that some things we can have an AI answer somebody and annoy somebody who's trying to get an answer about an airline ticket, and the AI is answering back, I don't understand your question or something like that. But at the same time, we have to have that outlet of the human contact and the human being helping support that or mitigating the risk of AI not quite learning where they need to go. The biggest things we have to concern ourselves with too is the fact that we have cross-culture collaboration these days, and the movement of people is so much easier. I think we bring people in, we have to upskill our team to be able to cope with this technology. Moving from paper charts in the hospital to computers was very difficult, and it sidelined a lot of people who would have probably worked 3 or 4 or 5 more years, right? They decided, you know what, I'm not dealing with this technology. I don't have to work. I'm retiring. Now we went through a huge change and transformation of our work with the pandemic, whether it's remote work or anything like that. And it comes with its own problems, whether it's social, emotional, or the technology parts and pieces. We've got this normalizing of a cross-border collaboration from all sorts of different things. We need to make sure that the human being walking into the space is skilled up as quickly as possible, because we're going to need that support to fill in the gaps in our future needs, whether it's physicians, nurses, engineers, labor, white collar or blue collar. All of that work is going to require new knowledge and new experience. So that's probably the biggest things that I can see.
What parts of healthcare do you think AI could assist in the most in the future?
I think it's about augmenting the healthcare worker. We have tools such as ambient AI sitting in a room where a physician having a conversation with a patient will basically go through and talk about the game and how good the popcorn was. And the AI is not going to do anything with it. But as soon as they start saying, I'm seeing this, I'm hearing this in your lungs, etc., then the AI begins to pull that information into a report, and the physician can walk out of the room, read his notes, and instead of the physician having to sit there with his eyes down on his computer taking notes the whole entire time, now he has contact with the patient. He can see more patients during that time, but it also decreases his level of frustrating work, because physicians want to take care of patients, right? That's what they signed up to do, but they didn't want to do the paperwork and the billing and all the craziness that goes with that. I think that's one component that will help improve the experience of the patient, as well as improve the physician's experience too, which will decrease their workload margin to be able to deliver outcomes and experience. Our radiologist will look at a CT scan while a AI in the background is also looking at things, highlighting certain things that it's seeing, and the physician can scroll through and look, oh, let me look at that again. And they can focus on that particular thing which might have missed their vision at some point or the other. And that'll be an additional improvement for safety, for workload. Ultimately, we're training systems that can basically do this in situations where a physician may not be available. It's not going to be optimal, but think about a battlefield. We've already heard about battlefield hospitals and things like that. When you have a surgeon, as long as you've got the good connection, you can be working on a robot. Somebody's operating it there that doesn't have the surgical skill to do a procedure, but they can help set up the tool, do whatever needs to be done locally, and somebody's getting excellent care because of the fact that somebody's on the back end. Those are all tremendous things that will basically help to improve healthcare, and not just healthcare, but really just outcomes across the board for so many different people.
Are people using those robots today, or is that still in research?
No, the robots are being used. We use them every day in an OR, except that the surgeon is sitting in the corner of the room, heads down in a camera doing this, and the robot's at the table doing that with the team around it, supporting that. So that work is being done. I'm not 100% sure where it's being done on a regular basis, remotely and long distance, because again, internet connection and things like that is always a little bit of a challenge. So you have to have some backup strategy for that. I'm not familiar with specifics on it, but I know that's also a future thing that is not so future anymore, because we're already doing the work. And I'm talking about, we have surgeons who've done 10,000 this procedure, 10,000 that procedure. That's a lot of procedures.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
AdventHealth is a large organization. I've seen with different large organizations, it's easy to get different silos. Are there tips that you have for breaking down some of the silos? And you talked earlier about the system approach.
Right.
So how do you help with that?
Yeah, no, I think it's an important thing, and I can give you just a straight example from us with working in risk management. So I have responsibility for 5 campuses. We have 2 other directors who have additional similar size type work, and we come together working through our leader. But we have certain cases in their criteria. They go to a serious event assessment team, right? that serious event assessment team is a multidisciplinary team that's chaired by our vice president and a chief medical officer who's also the patient safety officer for the division. And that work is basically done to help keep everybody aware of things. And then what things are done in root cause analysis, process improvement, things like that are brought back and presented there. And then the question is always, how are we spreading this out? How is everybody else hearing about it? So it's important to build your structure in some fashion that huddle and debrief that basically happens in your frontline team in those spaces gets moved into, okay, we huddled on the unit. Now I'm going to the next step meeting and huddling with leaders across a campus. And that leaders across the campus has a C-suite listening into that conversation that brings it up and discusses it in the C-suite and then cascades back the fix. And then up here, this is shared broadly, depends on whatever the situation is, whether it's business, whether it's process, whether it's a strategy and things like that you're basically connecting that information across and getting that feedback, because none of us live in isolation. And so it's very important that within an organization anyways, that competition is only on how do we do this better for our patients. So that competition is really the outside, and you're building your strategic advantages within the organization by sharing the information. And really your competitive advantage comes down to how well you interact and keep these silos down. But in my world, I'm always saying, what are they doing about this? Didn't we hear this before? Why are we doing this now? So yeah, always mixing and having that central leadership is very important too.
So the cross-functional team seems to be key.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
Cool. So as kind of close this up, do you have any advice for CEOs, just general advice for CEOs who are trying to improve their risk management?
Yeah. Just from my observations of great leaders that I've had the opportunity to be around, it's really about relationship where that C-suite, that CEO can call the frontline person's name practically, right? Depends on the size of your organization, okay? But our system chief medical officer who retired last year, I ran into him at a author's salon just 2 days ago, and he called me by name. And I spent about 2 months mentoring with him once a week, just stopping in, asking a couple of questions for about 30 minutes or so, and that was it. And this guy still remembers my name, right? The CEO of the company, I've had the opportunity to meet a few times, but I worked a few down from him. He knows my name. I'm blown away. This guy has over 50 something hospitals around the nation that he is in contact with, but he remembers my name. So for whatever reason. And that is huge, because I feel like, you know what, I can reach out to Terry Shaw and say, hey, I have this concern. I can reach out to this physician or whatever and say that kind of thing. So that psychological safety we just talked about that drives the culture of your organization is the first step into that learning process. It's going to make you improve your work. If your team's psychologically safe, they can come to you and speak to you about things and can be transparent. That's your opening for learning, and that's how we become a competitively advantaged company and we get better. And the work gets easier for that leader because he's no longer pulling teeth, right? You just push the ball and you just let the momentum roll by creating that psychological safety that people can come to you. There's a lot more technicalities to it than just that, but that would probably be the topmost thing. Leaders own a culture and a learning, and it's driven by that psychological safety and that relationship. Maxwell talks about the leadership is influence, right? Leadership is influence, and influence comes from a trust relationship. And that trust relationship is about me psychologically safe to speak about issues, speak to that person, things like that, respectfully, appropriately, and things like that. That all goes into play. But that's really the key.
Awesome. Do you have any favorite business books or risk management books? off the top of your head?
Oh, goodness gracious. It's hard to say I have a favorite. I listen a lot. I read a lot in email and so many things that now reading is more of I'm listening. Sometimes I buy the book and just listen to it, and so I can go back and reference different things. Things like Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Just to figure out how do we drive things quickly, but at the same time, take the time to think in advance. So when you think about risk management, you have to take the time to forecast your horizon, plan your plan, and then when things are going, you go back to, okay, this is the framework. Let's see. Crucial Conversations is a good friend. I read that or listen to it often. And then there's a new book by Maxwell as well. It's just thinking differently. How do you get that different perspective? And so I think those are probably some of my newer favorites as we go along. If you want to fall back, How to Win Friends and Influence People is probably one of my favorites that I've paid my boys to read that book when they were like young teens. Listen, this book's going to change your life. I want an outline. Here's $20. Yeah.
Wadie, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, Seth. Very nice to be with you, and I appreciate the time.